The House in the Rue Plumet. Part 1. Toward the middle of the last century, a velvet-capped president of the Parlement of Paris, having a mistress and concealing it, for in those days the great lords exhibited their mistresses, and the bourgeois concealed theirs, had une petite maison built in the Faubourg Saint-Germain, in the deserted Rue de Blomet, now called the Rue Plumet, not far from the spot which then went by the name of the Combat des Animaux. This was a summer house, of but 2 stories, 2 rooms on the ground floor, 2 chambers in the second story, a kitchen below, a boudoir above, a garret next to the roof, the whole fronted by a garden with a large iron-grated gate opening on the street. This garden contained about an acre. This was all that the passers-by could see. But in the rear of the house there was a small yard, at the further end of which there was a low building, 2 rooms only, and a cellar, a convenience intended to conceal a child and nurse in case of need. This building communicated, from the rear, by a masked door opening secretly, with a long narrow passage, paved, winding, open to the sky, bordered by 2 high walls, and which, concealed with wonderful art, and, as it were, lost between the enclosures of the gardens and fields, all the corners and turnings of which it followed, came to an end at another door, also concealed, which opened a third of a mile away, almost to another quarter, upon the unbuilt end of the Rue de Babylone. This house, and this passage, which have since disappeared, were still in existence 15 years ago. The house remained, furnished with its old furniture, and always for sale or to let, and the 10 or 12 persons who passed through the Rue Plumet in the course of a year were notified of this by a yellow and illegible piece of paper which had hung upon the railing of the garden since 1810. Toward the end of the Restoration, these same passers might have noticed that the paper had disappeared, and that, also, the shutters of the upper story were open. The house was, indeed, occupied. The windows had little curtains, sign there was a woman there. In the month of October, 1829, a man of a certain age had appeared and hired the house as it stood, including, of course, the building in the rear, and the passage which ran out to the Rue de Babylone. He had the secret openings of the 2 doors of this passage repaired. The new tenant had ordered a few repairs, and finally came and installed himself with a young girl and an aged servant, without any noise, rather like somebody stealing in than like a man who enters his own house. The neighbors did not gossip about it, for the reason that there were no neighbors. This tenant, to a partial extent, was Jean Valjean. The young girl was Cosette. The servant was a spinster named Toussaint, whom Jean Valjean had saved from the hospital in misery, and who was old, stuttering, and a native of Provence. 3 qualities which had determined Jean Valjean to take her with him. He hired the house under the name of Monsieur Fauchelevent, gentleman. In what has been related hitherto, the reader doubtless recognized Jean Valjean even before Thénardier did. Why had Jean Valjean left the convent of the Petite Picpus? What had happened? Nothing had happened. As we remember, Jean Valjean was happy in the convent, so happy that his conscience at last began to be troubled. He saw Cosette every day. He felt paternity springing up and developing within him more and more. He brooded this child within his soul. He said to himself that she was his, that nothing could take her from him, that this would be so indefinitely, that certainly she would become a nun, being every day gently led on toward it. In reflecting upon this, he at last began to find difficulties. He questioned himself. He asked himself if all this happiness were really his own, and if it were not made up of the happiness of another, of the happiness of this child, whom he was appropriating and plundering, he, an old man, if this was not a robbery. He said to himself that this child had a right to know what life was before renouncing it, that to cut her off in advance, and in some sort without consulting her, from all pleasure, under pretence of saving her from all trial, to take advantage of her ignorance and isolation, to give her an artificial vocation, was to outrage a human creature and to lie to God. And who knows but, thinking over all this some day, and being a nun with regret, Cosette might come to hate him. A final thought, which was almost selfish and less heroic than the others, but which was insupportable to him. He resolved to leave the convent. His determination once formed, he awaited an opportunity. It was not slow to present itself. Old Fauchelevent died. Jean Valjean asked an audience of the Reverend Prioress, and told her that having received a small inheritance on the death of his brother, which enabled him to live henceforth without labor, he would leave the service of the convent and take away his daughter, but that, as it was not just that Cosette, not taking her vows, should have been educated gratuitously, he humbly begged the Reverend Prioress to allow him to offer the community, as indemnity for the 5 years which Cosette had passed there, the sum of 5,000 francs. On leaving the convent, he took in his own hands, and would not entrust to any assistant, the little box, the key of which he always had about him. This box puzzled Cosette on account of the odour of embalming that came from it. Let us say at once that henceforth this box never left him more. He always had it in his room. It was the first and sometimes the only thing that he carried away in his changes of abode. Cosette laughed about it, and called this box the inseparable, saying, "I am jealous of it." Jean Valjean, nevertheless, did not appear again in the open city without deep anxiety. He discovered the house in the Rue Plumet, and buried himself in it. It was henceforth in possession of the name of Ultimus Fauchelevent. At the same time, he hired 2 other lodgings in Paris, very humble and of a poor appearance, in 2 quarters widely distant from each other, one in the Rue de l'Ouest, the other in the Rue de l'Homme Armé. He went from time to time, now to the Rue de l'Homme Armé, and now to the Rue de l'Ouest, to spend a month or 6 weeks with Cosette, without taking Toussaint. He was waited upon by the porters, and gave himself out for a man of some means of the suburbs, having a foothold in the city. This lofty virtue had 3 domiciles in Paris in order to escape from the police. Still, properly speaking, he lived in the Rue Plumet, and he ordered his life there in the following manner. Cosette, with the servant, occupied the house. She had the large bedroom with the painted piers, the boudoir with the gilded mouldings, the president's parlour furnished with tapestry and huge armchairs. She had the garden. All winter, Cosette's petite maison was warmed from top to bottom. For his part, he lived in the sort of porter's lodge in the backyard, with a mattress on a cot bedstead, a whitewood table, 2 straw chairs, an earthen water pitcher, a few books upon a board, his dear box in a corner, never any fire. He dined with Cosette, and there was a black loaf on the table for him. Cosette had been trained to housekeeping in the convent, and she regulated the expenses, which were very moderate. Every day, Jean Valjean took Cosette's arm, and went to walk with her. They went to the least frequented walk of the Luxembourg, and every Sunday to Mass, always at Saint-Jacques-de-Haut-Pas, because it was quite distant. As that is a very poor quarter, he gave much alms there, and the unfortunate surrounded him in the church. He was fond of taking Cosette to visit the needy and the sick. No stranger came into the house in the Rue de Plumet. Toussaint brought the provisions, and Jean Valjean himself went after the water to a watering trough which was nearby on the boulevard. Monsieur Fauchelevent belonged to the National Guard. He had not been able to escape the close meshes of the enrolment of 1831. The municipal investigation, made at that time, had extended even to the convent of the Petit Picpus, a sort of impenetrable and holy cloud, from which Jean Valjean had come forth venerable in the eyes of his magistracy, and in consequence worthy of mounting guard. 3 or 4 times a year, Jean Valjean donned his uniform and performed his duties. Very willingly, moreover. It was a good disguise for him, which associated him with everybody else while leaving him solitary. To resemble the crowd who paid their taxes, this was his whole ambition. This man had for his ideal within the angel, without the bourgeois. Neither Jean Valjean, nor Cosette, nor Toussaint ever came in or went out, except by the gate on the Rue de Babylone. Unless one had seen them through the grated gate of the garden, it would have been difficult to guess that they lived in the Rue Plumet. This gate always remained closed. Jean Valjean had left the garden uncultivated, that it might not attract attention. Part 2. Cosette had left the convent, still almost a child. She was a little more than 14 years old, and she was at the ungrateful age. As we have said, apart from her eyes, she seemed rather homely than pretty. She had, however, no ungraceful features, but she was awkward, thin, timid, and bold at the same time. A big child, in short. Nothing prepares a young girl for passions like the convent. The convent turns the thoughts in the direction of the unknown. The heart, thrown back upon itself, makes for itself a channel, being unable to overflow, and deepens, being unable to expand. On leaving the convent, Cosette could have found nothing more grateful and more dangerous than the house on the Rue Plumet. It was the continuation of solitude with the beginning of liberty. An enclosed garden, but a sharp, rich, voluptuous, and odorous nature. The same dreams as in the convent, but with glimpses of young men, a grating, but upon the street. Still, we repeat, when she came there she was but a child. She loved her father, that is to say Jean Valjean, with all her heart, with a frank filial passion, which made the good man a welcome and very pleasant companion for her. This simple man was sufficient for Cosette's thought, even as this wild garden was to her eyes. When she had had a good chase after the butterflies, she would run up to him breathless, and say, "Oh, how I have run!" He would kiss her forehead. Cosette had but vague remembrance of her childhood. She prayed morning and evening for her mother, whom she had never known. The Thénardiers had remained to her like two hideous faces of some dream. She remembered that she had been, one day, at night, sent into a wood after water. She thought that this was very far from Paris. It seemed to her that she had commenced life in an abyss, and Jean Valjean had drawn her out of it. Her childhood impressed her as a time when there were only centipedes, spiders, and snakes about her. When she was dozing at night, before going to sleep, as she had no very clear idea of being Jean Valjean's daughter, and that he was her father, she imagined that her mother's soul had passed into this good man, and come to live with her. While Cosette was a little girl, Jean Valjean had been fond of talking with her about her mother. When she was a young maiden, this was impossible for him. It seemed to him that he no longer dared. Was this on account of Cosette? Was it on account of Fantine? He felt a sort of religious horror at introducing that shade into Cosette's thoughts, and at bringing the dead a third sharer of their destiny. The more sacred that shade was to him, the more formidable it seemed to him. He thought of Fantine and felt overwhelmed with silence. He saw dimly in the darkness something which resembled a finger on a mouth. Had all that modesty which had once been Fantine's, and which, during her life, had been forced out of her by violence, returned after her death to take its place over her, to watch indignant over the peace of the dead woman, and to guard her fiercely in her tomb? Did Jean Valjean, without knowing it, feel its influence? We who believe in death are not of those who would reject this mysterious explanation. Hence the impossibility of pronouncing, even at Cosette's desire, this name, Fantine. One day, Cosette said to him, "Father, I saw my mother in a dream last night. She had two great wings. My mother must have attained to sanctity in her life." "Through martyrdom," answered Jean Valjean. Still, Jean Valjean was happy. When Cosette went out with him, she leaned upon his arm, proud, happy, in the fullness of her heart. Jean Valjean, at all these marks of a tenderness so exclusive, and so fully satisfied with him alone, felt his thought melt into delight. The poor man shuddered, overflowed with an angelic joy. He declared in his transport that this would last through life. He said to himself that he really had not suffered enough to deserve such radiant happiness. And he thanked God, in the depths of his soul, for having permitted that he, a miserable man, should be so loved by this innocent being. Part 3. One day, Cosette happened to look in her mirror, and she said to herself, "What?" It appeared to her almost that she was pretty. This threw her into strange anxiety. Up to this moment she had never thought of her face. She had seen herself in her glass, but she had not looked at herself. And then, she had often been told that she was homely. Jean Valjean alone would quietly say, "Why, no, why, no." However that might be, Cosette had always thought herself homely, and had grown up in that idea with the pliant resignation of childhood. And now suddenly her mirror said like Jean Valjean, "Why, no." She had no sleep that night. "If I were pretty," thought she, "how funny it would be if I should be pretty." And she called to mind those of her companions whose beauty had made an impression in the convent, and said, "What? I should be like Mademoiselle such a one." She was in the garden one day, and heard poor old Toussaint saying, "Monsieur, do you notice how pretty Mademoiselle is growing?" Cosette did not hear what her father answered. Toussaint's words threw her into a sort of commotion. She ran out of the garden, went up to her room, hurried to the glass, it was 3 months since she had last looked at herself, and uttered a cry. She was dazzled by herself. She was beautiful and handsome. She could not help being of Toussaint's and her mirror's opinion. Her form was complete. Her skin had become white. Her hair had grown lustrous. An unknown splendor was lighted up in her blue eyes. The consciousness of her beauty came to her entire. In a moment, like broad daylight, when it bursts upon us, she went down into the garden again, thinking herself a queen, hearing the birds sing, it was in winter, seeing the sky, golden, the sunshine in the trees, flowers among the shrubbery, wild, mad, in inexpressible rapture. For his part, Jean Valjean felt a deep and undefinable anguish in his heart. He had, in fact, for some time past, been contemplating with terror that beauty which appeared every day more radiant upon Cosette's sweet face, a dawn charming to all others, dreary to him. He said to himself, "How beautiful she is! What will become of me?" From the morrow of the day on which she had said, "Really, I am handsome," Cosette gave attention to her dress. In less than a month, little Cosette was, in that Thebaid of the Rue de Babylone, not only one of the prettiest women, which is something, but one of the best dressed in Paris, which is much more. The first day that Cosette went out with her dress and mantle of black damask, and her white crape hat, she came to take Jean Valjean's arm, gay, radiant, rosy, proud, and brilliant. "Father," said she, "how do you like this?" Jean Valjean answered in a voice which resembled the bitter voice of envy, "Charming." From that day, he noticed that Cosette, who previously was always asking to stay in, saying, "Father, I enjoy myself better here with you," was now always asking to go out. Indeed, what is the use of having a pretty face and a delightful dress if you do not show them? Cosette, by learning that she was beautiful, lost the grace of not knowing it. An exquisite grace, for beauty heightened by artlessness is ineffable, and nothing is so adorable as dazzling innocence, going on her way and holding in her hand, all unconscious, the key of paradise. But what she lost in ingenious grace, she gained in pensive and serious charm. Her whole person, pervaded by the joys of youth, innocence, and beauty, breathed a splendid melancholy. It was at this period that Marius, after the lapse of 6 months, saw her again at the Luxembourg. Part 4. Cosette, in her seclusion, like Marius in his, was all ready to take fire. Destiny, with its mysterious and fatal patience, was slowly bringing these two beings near each other, fully charged and all languishing with the stormy electricities of passion. These two souls which held love as two clouds hold lightning, and which were to meet and mingle in a glance like clouds in a flash. The power of a glance has been so much abused in love stories that it has become to be disbelieved in. Few people dare now to say that two beings have fallen in love, because they have never looked at each other. Yet it is in this way that love begins, and in this way only. The rest is only the rest, and comes afterward. Nothing is more real than these great shocks which two souls give each other in exchanging these sparks. At that particular moment, when Cosette unconsciously looked with this glance which so affected Marius, Marius had no suspicion that he had also a glance which affected Cosette. She received from him the same harm and the same blessing. We remember Marius's hesitations, his palpitations, his terrors. He remained at his seat and did not approach, which vexed Cosette. One day she said to Jean Valjean, "Father, let us walk a little this way." Seeing that Marius was not coming to her, she went to him. That day Cosette's glance made Marius mad. Marius' glance made Cosette tremble. Marius went away confident and Cosette anxious. From that day onward they adored each other. The first thing that Cosette felt was a vague and yet deep sadness. It seemed to her that since yesterday her soul had become black. She no longer recognized herself. The whiteness of soul of young girls, which is composed of coldness and gaiety like snow, it melts before love, which is its sun. It proved that the love which had presented itself was precisely the best suited to the condition of her soul. It was a sort of far-off worship, a mute contemplation, a deification by an unknown votary. It was the apprehension of adolescence by adolescence. The dream of her nights became a romance, and remaining a dream, the wished-for phantom realized at last, and made flesh, but still having neither name nor wrong, nor stain nor need, nor defect, in a word, a lover distant and dwelling in the ideal. A chimera, having form. Any closer and more palpable encounter would at this first period have terrified Cosette, still half buried in the magnifying mirrors of the cloister. She had all the terrors of children and all the terrors of nuns commingled. The spirit of the convent, with which she had been imbued for 5 years, was still slowly evaporating from her whole person, and made everything tremulous about her. In this condition, it was not a lover that she needed. It was not even an admirer. It was a vision. She began to adore Marius as something charming, luminous, and impossible. As extreme artlessness means extreme coquetry, she smiled upon him very frankly. Marius and Cosette were in the dark in regard to each other. They did not speak, they did not bow, they were not acquainted. They saw each other, and like the stars in the sky separated by millions of leagues, they lived by gazing upon each other. Thus it was that Cosette gradually became a woman, and beautiful and loving, grew with consciousness of her beauty and in ignorance of her love, coquettish withal, through innocence. Part 5. Every condition has its instinct. The old and eternal mother, nature, silently warned Jean Valjean of the presence of Marius. Jean Valjean shuddered in the darkness of his mind. Jean Valjean saw nothing, knew nothing, but still gazed with persistent fixedness at the darkness which surrounded him, as if he perceived on one side something which was building, and on the other something which was falling. Marius also warned, and, according to the deep law of God, by this same mother, nature, did all that he could to hide himself from the Father. It happened, however, that Jean Valjean sometimes perceived him. Marius' ways were no longer at all natural. He had an equivocal prudence and an awkward boldness. Jean Valjean cordially detested this young man. He had never opened his mouth to Cosette about the unknown man. One day, however, he could not contain himself, and with that uncertain despair which hastily drops the plummet into its unhappiness, he said to her, "What a pedantic air that young man has!" Cosette, a year before, an unconcerned little girl, would have answered, "Why, no, he is charming." 10 years later, with the love of Marius in her heart, she would have answered, "Pedantic and insupportable to the sight, you are quite right." At the period of life, of heart, which she was then, she merely answered with supreme calmness, "That young man," as if she saw him for the first time in her life. "How stupid I am," thought Jean Valjean. "She had not even noticed him. I have shown him to her myself." O simplicity of the old, depth of the young! There was nevertheless a painful tremor in the heart. The moment when Cosette would fall in love might come at any instant. Does not everything begin by indifference? Jean Valjean had not discontinued the promenades in the Luxembourg, not wishing to do anything singular, and above all, dreading to excite any suspicion in Cosette. But during those hours so sweet to the two lovers, while Cosette was sending her smile to the intoxicated Marius, who perceived nothing but that, and now saw nothing in the world save one radiant, adored face, Jean Valjean fixed upon Marius glaring and terrible eyes. He who had come to believe that he was no longer capable of a malevolent feeling had moments in which, when Marius was there, he thought he was again becoming savage and ferocious, and felt opening and upheaving against this young man those old depths of his soul, where there had once been so much wrath. It seemed to him almost as if the unknown craters were forming within him again. We know the rest. The insanity of Marius continued. One day he followed Cosette to the Rue de l'Ouest. A week after, Jean Valjean had moved. He resolved that he would never set his foot again, either in the Luxembourg or in the Rue de l'Ouest. He returned to the Rue Plumet. Cosette did not complain. She said nothing. She asked no questions. She did not seek to know any reason. She was already at that point at which one fears discovery and self-betrayal. Jean Valjean had no experience of this misery, the only misery which is charming, and the only misery which he did not know. For this reason, he did not understand the deep significance of Cosette's silence. He noticed only that she had become sad, and he became gloomy. Sometimes he asked her, "What is the matter with you?" She answered, "Nothing." And after a silence, she felt as if he was sad also. She continued, "And you, father, is not something the matter with you?" "Me? Nothing," said he. These two beings, who had loved each other so exclusively, and with so touching a love, and who had lived so long for each other, were now suffering by each other, and through each other, without speaking of it, without harsh feeling, and smiling the while.